June 8, 2022. The sun had set over Alton, Illinois, and a peaceful silence settled over the neighborhood. On a quiet street, a young woman named Lisa Dodd was living her life, a life full of hope and expectation. At just 22 years old, she was 8 months pregnant with a baby girl whom her family lovingly called Baby Bean. Lisa was a kind and bright person, known for her love of animals and her hard work at a local Dairy Queen. She was saving money to follow her dream of working in the medical field, just like her mother. The baby's arrival was just around the corner, and the family had recently sent out invitations for a baby shower. Everyone was excited about the new life coming into the world. However, a darkness had been slowly growing around Lisa. For 2 years, she had been in a difficult on-again, off-again relationship with a man named DeAndre Holloway. Their relationship was troubled and often violent. DeAndre had a history of substance abuse and a difficult home life. He often came and went, leaving Lisa alone and worried. Tonight was one of those nights. DeAndre had disappeared, and Lisa was left feeling anxious and distressed. The quiet street outside her apartment offered a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. She was reaching a breaking point, and the peace of the night wouldn't last. The troubled relationship. The problems between Lisa and DeAndre were nothing new. For years, their relationship had been a series of arguments and fights. Lisa's boss at Dairy Queen had seen the bruises and black eyes she would often try to hide. At first, she would make up excuses, like her dog had accidentally hurt her. But eventually, she admitted the truth. They were always arguing and fighting. The violence was so severe that on one occasion, her boss even saw DeAndre punch her in the face while they were in a car. Lisa was so afraid that she refused to call the police, even though her boss wanted to. The violence had even sent her to the hospital once after DeAndre broke her nose. Lisa's friends and family were deeply concerned. She had even told her mother that DeAndre had threatened to harm them. In one text message to her boss, she wrote that her boyfriend had beaten her again and she needed to stay in a safe place. She was constantly trying to make their relationship work, but it was clear to everyone around her that DeAndre's behavior was dangerous. He would go missing for days at a time, leaving Lisa alone and worried. On top of everything, he was the father of her unborn child, which made it difficult for her to simply walk away. This vicious cycle of violence and reconciliation seemed impossible for her to escape. Anxious and alone. The day before, on June 7th, DeAndre had vanished. He didn't come home from work and didn't leave a message. He even left his phone behind, which was a bad sign. Lisa, already stressed and 8 months pregnant, was understandably worried. She texted her mom, Heidi, late that night, filled with anxiety. "You think he'd just leave like this?" she wrote, fearing that he had taken some clothes and left for good. Heidi, who had been concerned about the relationship for a long time, tried to comfort her daughter. She saw a glimmer of hope, telling Lisa that this might be a nonviolent way for her to finally be free. But Lisa couldn't see it that way. She was heartbroken and felt like she was being left. The pressure of her life, the problems with DeAndre, and the stress of her pregnancy had taken a terrible toll on her. During their text conversation, she confessed to her mom that she was feeling so desperate she had cut her leg with a razor. Her mom calmly asked why, and Lisa replied, "Because I just can't get it right." It was a heartbreaking moment, revealing the deep pain Lisa was carrying. Even though her mom tried to calm her down, Lisa was too anxious to sleep. In the early morning hours, she took her car out for a drive, a desperate attempt to find peace.
On the morning of June 8th, Lisa was still on edge. At 7:06 a.m., she texted her mom, "Still no." DeAndre hadn't come home. Lisa went through her morning routine, washing her work clothes as if it were a normal day, but her gut told her something was very wrong. She told her mom that she felt like he would still show up, but she couldn't be sure. Heidi suggested that Lisa call the police to see if he had been arrested, or to talk to her landlord, Joe, to check the surveillance cameras. Lisa followed her mother's advice and texted Joe, asking him to look at the cameras to see when DeAndre had left and what he was wearing. Joe, the landlord, checked the footage and found that DeAndre had left the apartment building the previous evening around 6:24 p.m. with his uncle, Marty, who lived in St. Louis. DeAndre's family was hoping that Marty would bring him back later that night, but he never did. The fact that DeAndre didn't return worried everyone, especially since he hadn't even called. PJ, DeAndre's half-sister, went to bed early that night, not knowing what would happen next. This was a family in crisis, trying to figure out where one of their own had gone. But soon they would find out that the truth was much worse than they could have ever imagined. At about 8 p.m. on the night of June 8th, Lisa received a message from DeAndre's uncle, Marty. The text said that everything was okay and that Marty was bringing DeAndre back. Lisa immediately told her mom the news. Heidi was not happy. She was angry that her heavily pregnant daughter was being put through so much stress. She didn't trust DeAndre and felt that he was treating Lisa terribly. Heidi warned Lisa to be careful, telling her, "Of course it's your fault. That, and you better be careful so he doesn't give you something that Bean will catch." Heidi's words were a mother's warning, filled with frustration and fear. Despite her mom's concerns, Lisa went to pick DeAndre up. She was seen on surveillance cameras arriving back at their apartment building with him at 9:11 p.m. While in the car, just before they went inside, she sent a final text message to her mom. "I'm trying to figure it out." It was a message that showed her struggle, her attempt to make sense of the chaos in her life. This was the last time anyone would hear from her. Heidi texted her an hour and a half later at 10:49 p.m. to see if she was okay, but she received no reply. By then, it was already too late. Lisa was already dead. The quiet street and the normal evening would soon be a crime scene. The neighbor's account. The downstairs neighbors of Lisa and DeAndre knew their relationship was troubled. They had heard the couple fighting many times before and even called the police on them. They were used to the loud arguments, the slamming sounds, and the shaking of the building. But on the night of June 8th, something was different. They got home from work around 9:30 p.m. and noticed that the door to Lisa and DeAndre's apartment was cracked open, which was very unusual. They heard muffled yelling from inside the apartment, not screaming, but a kind of pained yelling. It sounded like a scream that was being held back. The building started to shake as the fighting got worse. The neighbors thought about going outside to wait for it to stop, but they decided to wait and see what would happen. Then, all of a sudden, the muffled yelling turned into very loud, very intense screaming. They guessed it was around 9:45 or 9:50 p.m. The screaming was followed by 5 or 6 loud thuds that got louder with each hit and shook the whole apartment. The sound was so strange and steady that it made them think of a rhythmic action, like someone chopping wood. They heard 5 or 6 of those loud thuds, and then everything went silent. The screaming stopped, the sound stopped, and the apartment stopped shaking. They were sure someone was still upstairs because the lights in the apartment kept turning on and off. The neighbors assumed it was Lisa. After a while, they went outside and waited, hoping to see either Lisa or DeAndre come down the stairs, which was what usually happened after a fight. But this time, no one came down. The silence was absolute. It was a terrifying silence, unlike any they had ever heard after one of the couple's fights. The neighbors texted their landlord, telling him what they had heard. They explained the thumping and the screaming and how it had all suddenly stopped. The landlord tried to get in touch with Lisa, but she didn't answer. The neighbors said that if they heard the sounds again, they would call the police, but they never heard them again. The silence was final, and the thuds that they had heard were not just a part of another loud fight.
That steady, rhythmic sound, which they had compared to the sound of chopping wood, was the sound of something horrific. It was the sound of Lisa's head being cut off. This act of violence had gone beyond anything they had ever heard, and it was now too late for anyone to help. At 11:57 p.m., almost an hour after the final thuds, a man was seen on surveillance cameras leaving the apartment building. He was carrying a white laundry basket. The man was Deundrea Holloway. He came to Lisa's car as if he had forgotten the keys. He was wearing different clothes now, including a face covering and dark shoes. He went back inside and came out again a few minutes later, still carrying the white laundry basket. He walked away from the apartment building, down the quiet street, and disappeared from view behind a smoke shop. He was heading for a dumpster. No one who saw him that night knew what was in the basket. In just a few minutes, another camera from a local business would capture the rest of the story. At 1 minute past midnight, the footage showed the white laundry basket being thrown into a large red dumpster, along with some clothes. The man on the camera was DeAndre. A few hours later, Lisa's black car was missing from the parking lot. DeAndre had taken it and gone to his mother's house. He was trying to get rid of any evidence of what he had done. The peaceful street had been completely unaware of the horror that had taken place. The white laundry basket was the final, terrible piece of a puzzle that would not be put together until the next day. A mother's fear. It was just after noon on June 9th. Lisa's mother, Heidi, hadn't heard from her daughter in over 15 hours. The last text she had received was at 9:11 p.m. the night before. All morning she had tried calling and texting Lisa, but her daughter never replied. Something felt terribly wrong. Heidi drove to Lisa's apartment to check on her. The apartment building looked normal from the outside. She let herself in with a key she had for the building. 2 minutes later, other residents of the building were seen opening their doors to see what was happening. Heidi came back outside, shaking with fear and grief. She was visibly distraught, and the expressions on her neighbors' faces told the whole story. They knew something awful had happened. Heidi was so overcome with emotion that she made a chilling 911 call. A person who answered asked for the address and the name of the victim. In a voice filled with pain, Heidi told the dispatcher, "My daughter's chopped her head off." The dispatcher was confused and asked her to repeat what she said. "My daughter's killed," Heidi said, correcting herself. "My girlfriend's daughter's killed?" the person on the phone said. Heidi, sobbing, said, No, my daughter has been chopped her head off."
Her words were a raw expression of a mother's worst nightmare. A nightmare she had already known was true. A gruesome discovery. Police arrived at the apartment building shortly after Heidi's 911 call. They found her sitting on the front steps, crying uncontrollably. She was still in a state of shock, and the first responders tried to calm her down. She gave them the code to enter the building, and the officers went inside. They went up to the second floor where Lisa's apartment was located. The door was unlocked. As police entered the apartment, they prepared themselves for what they knew they would find, but they could not have been ready for the sight that greeted them. Inside the bedroom, they discovered the lifeless body of a young woman. Her head was wrapped in a towel, like a turban, but underneath the towel, her head was gone. It had been cut off. Heidi's chilling words to the 911 dispatcher were true. The body had been desecrated in a way that shocked even the most experienced police officers. The apartment was otherwise clean, and there were no signs of the murder weapon or Lisa's head. The killer had removed them from the scene. The police knew that the killer had to have disposed of the head somewhere else, away from the apartment. The discovery sent a wave of horror through the peaceful neighborhood as residents learned that a young woman had been killed in such a brutal way. The dumpster. The gruesome discovery in Lisa's apartment was not the first sign that something was wrong on June 9th. A construction worker had already found something strange in a large red dumpster on the street, where he was throwing away drywall from a construction site. The dumpster was full of trash, but he noticed a lot of clothes and laundry baskets thrown all over the place. He also saw some shoes, including a pair of red slippers that were covered in blood. The sight of the bloody shoes and clothes made him feel uneasy. He picked up a knife that was nearby. The knife was short and had serrated teeth on the blade, like a paring knife. The handle of the knife also had blood on it. He immediately knew that something was not right. He wanted to get as far away from the scene as possible. The discovery of the knife and the bloody items in the dumpster was the first sign that this summer day would not be ordinary. This dumpster was the very same one that DeAndre had been seen walking toward the night before. The white laundry basket he had carried contained Lisa's head, which he had thrown into the dumpster alongside the bloody clothes and shoes. The construction worker had stumbled upon the murder weapon and the victim's belongings. His discovery was a crucial part of the investigation. A mother's knowledge. In her 911 call, Heidi, Lisa's mother, had been sure about who was responsible. She had told the dispatcher, "My daughter's boyfriend killed her. He chopped her head off." She didn't need to see DeAndre in the act to know what he had done. When the dispatcher asked if she had spoken to him, she said no. Heidi was aware of DeAndre's violent and threatening behavior. She had even taken out a protective order against him months earlier after he had stayed with her for a few days. She said that his behavior had become frightening, and after she told him he had to leave, he had called Lisa and threatened to kill them both. This earlier threat proved that Heidi's fears were not just a mother's worry, but a real danger. Her protective order was a testament to how dangerous DeAndre had been. When she heard that DeAndre had left her daughter's apartment without her, she knew that something terrible had happened. The fear she had lived with for months had become a reality. Her daughter had not been set free in a nonviolent way, as she had hoped. She had been brutally murdered, and DeAndre was on the run.
The events of the past 24 hours had now led to a full-scale police investigation. DeAndre's actions. After the murder, DeAndre did everything he could to cover his tracks. He changed his clothes and went to his mother's house. He arrived around 2:30 a.m. and was described as pacing and acting nervous. PJ, his half-sister, was asleep at the time, but her other sister was awake. She said that she heard DeAndre banging on the door and that when she opened it, she saw a black car, which she knew belonged to Lisa. It seemed strange to the family that DeAndre had come to the house in Lisa's car without Lisa herself. The signs were there that something was very wrong. The next morning, PJ found DeAndre in the bathroom cutting his hair off. He was nervous, and when she asked him why he was cutting his hair, he said it was for a fresh start. He had been proud of his dreadlocks and hadn't cut his hair in 2 years, so this was a very strange thing to do. It was clear that he was trying to change his appearance to avoid being recognized. He also asked for a shower and new clothes. After he showered, he took the clothes he had been wearing and put them by the sidewalk in the garbage can. He was trying to get rid of the evidence. The evidence. DeAndre's strange behavior continued after he cut his hair and changed his clothes. His grandmother noticed that he had some of Lisa's belongings with him. He had her ID and her debit card, which he gave to his grandmother. He also gave her 2 keys, claiming he had found them on the ground. His grandmother asked him why he had Lisa's things, but he didn't give her an answer. He just looked like he was in a daze. The fact that he was carrying her personal belongings was very suspicious. He was trying to get rid of them and handed them to his grandmother. She promised to try and get them back to Lisa, not knowing what had truly happened. DeAndre also took Lisa's car and left it on the street with a handwritten "for sale" sign in the window.
This was a clear attempt to get rid of the car. At midday, he told his grandmother that he was going to cut some grass, but he left on foot. His strange behavior, his efforts to change his appearance, and his attempts to get rid of Lisa's possessions were all clear signs that he was trying to hide what he had done. The family didn't know the full story, but they knew something was terribly wrong. DeAndre's actions confirmed the worst fears of Lisa's mother. The mental state of a killer. Weeks before the murder, DeAndre had been texting a friend about his mental state. His messages painted a picture of a man on the edge. He wrote that he felt like all the emotions he had ever put aside were now coming out at once. He said his cup filled up and now it's got to spill over. He confessed that he didn't know how to let out his emotions in a healthy way without either snapping or crying. He wrote that he had always had to be the man, even as a kid, and had been put in grown-up situations with a lot of pressure on him. This was the message of a person who felt like he was about to lose control. He seemed to be close to his breaking point. The stress of his life and his relationship with Lisa were clearly weighing on him. His half-sister, PJ, confirmed that he had been in a poor mental state. He would often disappear when he and Lisa got into fights, and no one would know where he went. His erratic behavior was a clear sign that he was struggling. The pressure of his life had built up to a point where he couldn't handle it anymore. The violence in their relationship with Lisa, along with his inner turmoil, were a dangerous combination that would eventually lead to tragedy. The neighbors hear everything. Lisa and DeAndre's downstairs neighbors had been a part of their tumultuous relationship.
They had heard the couple's loud fights many times and had even called the police before. On the evening of June 8th, they got home from work around 9:30 p.m. and immediately noticed that the couple's front door was cracked open, which was unusual. They began to hear muffled yelling from upstairs. It sounded like someone was trying to keep from screaming too loudly. The sounds made the neighbor think of a person in pain, like someone who had just cut their finger and was trying to muffle their scream. The apartment started to shake as the fight got more intense. The neighbors considered going outside to avoid the noise, but they decided to wait. Then, at about 9:45 p.m., the muffled yelling suddenly changed into very loud and intense screaming. The screaming went on for about 5 minutes, then stopped. It was followed by 5 or 6 loud thuds that shook the apartment and got louder each time. The neighbors were terrified. They had heard arguments before, but this was different. The sounds were more violent and personal. They knew something awful was happening upstairs, and the fear was so great that they were too scared to go out and see who it was. The noise was more than just a fight. It was something terrible. The chopping sound. The neighbor's description of the thudding sound was very specific. The sound, she said, was loud and constant. It was not a random thump or a bang. The sounds came in a rhythmic pattern, like a steady beat. When asked what it sounded like, she compared it to the sound of chopping wood. She said the person making the sound seemed to be putting all their weight and muscle into it, creating a clear, repetitive rhythm. She said you could hear the rhythm of the action, like lifting something up and bringing it down with force. The loud thuds continued 5 or 6 times, getting louder with each one. Then, all of a sudden, everything stopped. The screaming stopped, the thudding stopped, the shaking of the apartment stopped. The absolute silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sounds of the fight. The neighbors knew in their hearts that something terrible had happened upstairs. The sound they heard was not of a normal fight. It was the sound of a murder, in progress. It was the sound of DeAndre cutting off Lisa's head. This was the final, brutal moment of the crime, heard by the people who lived just below. The aftermath. The downstairs neighbors were terrified by the sudden silence. They heard someone leave the apartment, but they couldn't see who it was. They were too afraid to look. They were hoping that either Lisa or DeAndre would come down the stairs, as they usually did after a fight. But this time, neither one of them came down. The lights in the upstairs apartment kept turning on and off, which told them that someone was still inside. They just assumed it was Lisa. At this point, they didn't know that the person they were hoping to see was already dead. The terrifying sounds they had heard just minutes before had been the last moments of Lisa's life. The neighbor texted their landlord, telling them about the thumps and the screaming. The landlord tried to call Lisa but got no answer. The neighbor told the landlord that if the sound started up again, she would call the police. But it was already too late. The sounds never started again. The crime was already over. DeAndre had left the apartment, carrying the white laundry basket. The neighborhood was quiet again, but the quiet was a result of a horrific act.
The neighbors knew something was wrong, and the landlord knew something was wrong, but no one could have imagined the true horror of what had happened inside the apartment, the family search. The morning after the murder, PJ, DeAndre's half-sister, was still looking for him. The night before, she had gone to bed early, not knowing what had happened. Her sister, however, had been awake and had heard DeAndre banging on the door around 2:30 a.m. She looked outside and saw DeAndre in the driveway. She also saw a black car, which she recognized as Lisa's. The family thought it was strange that DeAndre had shown up at their house in Lisa's car without her. The fact that he was alone was a big red flag. The family was trying to figure out what was going on, but DeAndre wasn't giving them any answers. PJ said that when she found him cutting his hair, he just said he was looking for a fresh start. She could tell he was very nervous. The clothes he had been wearing, including a bucket hat, a hoodie, and a pair of pants, were all thrown into the garbage can outside the house. He was trying to get rid of any and all signs of the night before, but he didn't realize that his family had seen him with Lisa's car, and that his grandmother had seen him with Lisa's ID and keys. The evidence was all around him, but he was in a state of a daze. The for sale sign. After leaving his mother's house, DeAndre did one last thing to try and get rid of the evidence. He left Lisa's car parked on the street with a handwritten for sale sign in the window. It was another clear attempt to get rid of the vehicle and distance himself from the crime. At this point, the police had already discovered Lisa's body and were starting to piece together the events of the night before. They had found the discarded clothes in the garbage can outside DeAndre's mother's house. They knew that DeAndre was a person of interest. The police were preparing to start a manhunt for him, but they didn't have to. At around 1:45 a.m. on June 10th, the Alton Police Department received a phone call from the Gillespie, Illinois Police Department. The Gillespie police had taken a man into custody the afternoon before for possession of cannabis. They later realized that the man they had arrested was Deundrea Holloway. He had been arrested in another town, completely unaware that the police in Alton had already discovered Lisa's body and had linked him to the crime. His attempt to escape had failed. The arrest. When police arrested Deundrea Holloway and Gillespie, he was restless and acting strange. He asked the officers if he could stand up and walk around. He said he was just pacing, but the officers told him to sit down. He asked for water and seemed very nervous. He was trying to act calm and normal, but his actions gave him away. He was still trying to maintain his new fresh start, but it was clear that he was in a lot of trouble. He didn't know that the police in Alton had already discovered Lisa's body and had linked him to the crime. The police had found all the evidence they needed to charge him with murder. They had the surveillance footage of him carrying the laundry basket and throwing it into the dumpster. They had the witness accounts from the neighbors who had heard the fight and the screams. They had the bloody shoes and the knife from the dumpster. They also had his own family's testimony, who had seen him change his appearance and get rid of Lisa's personal belongings. He was now in custody, and the investigation was quickly coming to a close. The truth of what happened that night was becoming clearer and clearer. Uncovering the horrific truth,
the clothes in the dumpster were the same ones DeAndre was seen wearing in the surveillance footage. The white laundry basket was found with Lisa's head inside. The bloody shoes and the serrated knife were found in the same dumpster. The neighbor's testimony about the loud thuds and the sudden silence confirmed that the murder had happened in a quick and violent manner. Everything pointed to DeAndre as the killer. The police had also found the discarded dreadlocks wrapped in toilet paper in the trash outside DeAndre's mother's house, which proved he had cut his hair to change his appearance. His attempt to get rid of the evidence and his nervous behavior after the crime were clear signs of his guilt. His family had seen him with Lisa's car and her personal items, which he had tried to get rid of. The for sale sign on the car was the last piece of the puzzle, showing that he wanted to completely erase any connection to the crime. The police had a very strong case against him. The chilling confession. During her 911 call, Heidi, Lisa's mother, had spoken with a chilling clarity. She had said that Lisa's boyfriend had killed her and chopped her head off. Her words, which were so shocking, turned out to be the horrific truth. Heidi's gut feeling about what had happened was correct. She knew that DeAndre was a violent and dangerous man. Her fears and worries about him had been confirmed in the most terrible way possible. She had tried to get Lisa to leave him, but Lisa couldn't bring herself to do it. Heidi had even told her daughter that she was set free from a violent relationship, and Lisa had replied, "I'm not seeing it that way yet." Lisa was still hoping to make things work, even though her relationship was in a dark and violent place. The murder was a tragic end to a story of a young woman who was full of hope and dreams, but was caught in a cycle of violence. The people who knew her and loved her were heartbroken. They had lost not just one life, but two, as the baby inside her was also a victim of the crime. The tragedy was a terrible loss for the family. The aftermath and the arrest. The residents of Alton, Illinois were shaken to their core by the murder of Lisa Dodd. The peaceful street had been forever changed by the horror that had taken place inside one of the apartments. The neighbors who had heard the fight and the terrible silence were traumatized by what they had experienced. They couldn't bring themselves to imagine the details of what had happened, but they knew it was something horrific. The murder was a reminder that violence could happen anywhere, even in a quiet neighborhood. With DeAndre Holloway in custody, the police had all the evidence they needed to charge him with the murder of Lisa Dodd. He had been caught trying to escape, but he hadn't made it very far. The investigation was over, and the community could begin to heal. The story of Lisa Dodd was a heartbreaking one, a tale of a young woman who was full of hope and dreams, whose dreams were ended by a violent act. The people who loved her would never forget her, and the neighborhood would never be the same again. The white laundry basket and the chopping sound would forever be a part of the city's dark history.